The well-known Episcopalian preacher and author Fleming Rutledge tells the story about how from a very early age she had questions about how there could be so much evil in the world if God was good. At 12 years old, she writes, she took the time to sit down and pen a letter to her denominational magazine. It was kind of a religious version of the Dear Abby column. And in that letter, she asked the question, if God is so good, why is there so much evil in the world? She writes that the columnist actually published her question in the magazine, and her answer satisfied her curiosity for a few months until it started up again and lasted all the way through her college days. If God is so good, how can there be so much evil in the world? I suppose it's a question that many of us have asked ourselves, and sometimes people outside the church ask the question in an accusing, kind of critical way, a way to poke holes in the Christian way of seeing the world and understanding life. And into that whole arena of good and evil comes the first lesson for today, the story that the Christian tradition has often called the fall into sin. It's an important story for us to listen to and reflect on. But I'm sorry to inform you that the story is not going to explain the origin of evil. The question of the origin of evil is both a theological and a philosophical quagmire. Philosophers and theologians have been debating the question and offering various solutions for centuries, for millennia. And at least from my chair, I still don't think we have a very clear explanation. The Bible simply invites us to live with the ambiguity. It's not interested in explaining those kind of things, giving us a clear-cut solution to these kind of thorny problems. No, what the Bible is interested in is describing the reality of what it means to be human, about what our place is before God, and to draw us into these kinds of mysteries that are at the very heart of life. And evil, clearly, is one of those mysteries. A lot of times, that mystery of evil gets described as a mighty cosmic battle between God and Satan. But that is not the way this morning's story tells it. In our Bible story this morning, the garden is no battleground between God and Satan. In fact, if you listen to the story carefully, Satan isn't even mentioned in the story. It's a serpent. It's one of the creatures that is fashioned by God who appears to Adam and Eve and offers those first questioning questions. The temptation doesn't come from outside creation. One of God's own creatures poses the question and alternative explanations to what God has told Adam and Eve. You see, God created a very good world, though I would say not necessarily a perfect world. And here's what I mean by that. From the very opening verses of the story of Genesis, the creation, chaos and darkness hovered over the earth. And God came, and God spoke, and God's creative power fashioned order and beauty out of the chaos and darkness. While a very good world, God created it in such a way that neither humans nor the other creatures are robots. What I mean is that God created agency in the world, and God's process has always been open and dynamic. It had to be that way for us to have the freedom to love God without being coerced into loving God. And so while there is great freedom, God gave our first parents a single boundary in which that freedom was to be exercised. That's a pattern in the Bible. God gives freedom within certain boundaries. When God gave the Ten Commandments to Moses and the children of Israel, He gave those 10 commandments as boundaries within which freedom might be exercised. And as with every boundary God gives, they're not intended to keep us from enjoying life. In fact, they're intended to ensure that we enjoy life, the life as God intended it to be. The boundaries that God gives us are gracious limitations that God places around us for our own good. Now, I know I'm dating myself here, but some of you might remember the 1970s comic Flip Wilson. Anybody remember that? His identifying bit was always, "The devil made me do it." And it was always a way for him to avoid personal responsibility. But to say, "The devil made me do it," is to miss the important point that is at the heart of this morning's Bible story. When the serpent came to Adam and Eve posing as questions that led them to doubt God's goodness, God's providence, and God's gracious intent of God's boundaries, Adam and Eve both could have said to that serpent, "You're full of it. Get away. Go bother somebody else." But that's not how they responded. The response points to something different. It points to our human tendency to doubt our identity as creatures who have been created by the Creator. There has always been an arrogance about we humans, a bristling under authority that tells us what to do, and we shake our finger back at that story and say, "You're not the boss of me." Except that we are. And if you doubt the truth of that, just tell a small child that they have to wash their hands before dinner, because that's the rule. And you're likely to get a sharp no in response. The serpent came to Adam and Eve appealing to those suspicions and yearnings which were already present in the human heart. And in that sense, this story is not a story about the origin of evil. It's a story about pure disobedience and rebellion against God by both the man and the woman. They were in this together. Sin and evil are mysterious forces that arise from within God's good creation. Indeed, they arise from within our own hearts. Those yearnings and those suspicions are present in my heart, in your heart as well. And I will tell you that those yearnings and suspicions do not need much encouragement to come forth and issue in my own disobedient action. And I'll just let you reflect for a moment on how that works in your own life. We have 100, maybe 1,000, maybe 10,000 ways to justify things that we know are wrong. The one who fudges a few numbers on his tax return justifies it because, well, everybody does it. The one who hurts their loved ones with a few very pointed choice words excuses it. Well, they deserved it. And the one who gets that dastardly delight about spreading some juicy gossip about the neighbor excuses it, but I'm only telling the truth about what happened. But the Apostle Paul would remind us that our sin is not even the collection of our misdeeds. Our sin is a condition. We are in need of rescue and redemption. It's the fractured relationship with God that we have broken with our own rebellion, just like our parents in the garden. In our own rebellion, we have distorted our relationship with God. We have broken it. And now we are in need of salvation. Our sin is a thorny problem, a mess that we're not going to get out of by ourselves. And that's why, dear church, we read this gospel lesson along with the fall into sin on the first Sunday in Lent. While Lent is often about deepening our commitments and our spiritual disciplines, at its heart, it is all about Jesus, and all about looking to Jesus, and all about our call to focus on Jesus. Because when all is said and done, Jesus is what we need. In the temptation story, Jesus was true to his identity, true to the life-giving boundaries that God placed on him, true to those boundaries in his relationship with the Father. From the stark beginning of his ministry in this wilderness setting, all the way through his teaching and his healing, Jesus would maintain that identity and honor those God-given boundaries. So true would Jesus be to his identity that he would be obedient all the way to the cross, even, as Paul says, death on a cross. And so, at the very center of our life together is a cross, because the cross is our salvation. The cross is the enactment of God's plan to rescue us. The cross is the rescue from our sinful condition, and the cross is always what gives us life. During this Lenten season, each Sunday before we read the gospel, we sing a gospel acclamation that goes like this: Let your steadfast love come to us, O Lord. Save us as you promised. We will trust your word. Let your steadfast love come to us through the cross. Throughout this Lenten season, we will claim that love, and week after week, we will be invited to return to God, and we will be reminded that God continually brings us life through Jesus' death and resurrection. Jesus' death and resurrection is a reversal of our distortion of our relationship with God. In our baptism into Jesus' death and resurrection, we have received undeserved and unmerited grace that is beyond bounds. In the death and resurrection of Jesus, we experience God's extraordinary generosity. We have been set right with God. Salvation has come.